Okay guys, we are gonna do the classic princess style line pattern today. So we're gonna need the 2-dart bodice front, and finally gonna use the bodice back, which already has 2 darts. We're not gonna change that, so we could leave that as is. And this is definitely something you're gonna start to need your French curve for. So that's this kind of shape. It's also in the back of the book that you could print out and put this on cardstock if you don't have one of these. But these are like $3 on Amazon or online, pretty cheap and really awesome. And it's what we use to make all the round shapes in the neckline, in the armhole. All of these shapes are made by the French curve somehow. So it's a really good thing to have. So let's go ahead and get started. So we'll start with our bodice front, and with the princess style line, this line actually goes down sort of the middle, well, I'd say not the middle of the body, but the middle of the middle, like the quarter, like breaking the body into quarters. And so like on a mannequin or a dress form, there's often that line is already a seam created, and it goes from like the middle of the shoulder, cuts through the middle of the waist, like between the side seam and the center front, and goes all the way down the hips and so forth. And that's called the princess line. So the first thing we'll do is trace out our bodice front. And I'm using my cardstock, so it's easy to trace. And again, you can put a weight on this or something like that if you find that it's moving around on you. And I'm getting all my notches and all my shapes, and then don't forget to get that bust point in the center. Okay, so now I can draw my dart legs. So from that bust point down to the notch that I marked, to transfer those. And then also this side dart. I want to go ahead and make sure to transfer my grain line. We're going to cut this pattern up even a little bit more than we have been. So I definitely want to make sure I've got my grain line on there right away before we start cutting that up. And so again, what we're going to do is we want a line, a nice pretty line that goes from the middle of the shoulder basically all the way down to one of these lines. So that's what we'll do. We'll just pick a middle point on the shoulder. You can use your ruler and get exactly in the middle. When we use larger patterns, there's actually usually a notch there, and I just go off the notch. So for example, it's about 2 3/4. So we can pick a place in the center, somewhere like right there. Something that looks nice. And now that's going to be like our new slash line, just like we've been doing. So we'll draw a point from that place in the center of the shoulder to our bust point. And then another thing to think about, because now we're actually using a front and a back, and then in theory, basically these would go together, actually like this, like that would be the side seam that would match to the other side seam, that's the armhole, and this is where the shoulder matches to the shoulder. So actually that's something that maybe we should consider now. Instead of just choosing an arbitrary amount on the middle of the shoulder, I'm gonna go ahead and close this back bodice shoulder and pretend I was matching it up to this front bodice shoulder, and that's how it would match up, and then there's our neckline. So actually I'll go ahead and make a mark right there so that it'll naturally meet this place in the back. So now I'll just double check to see, yeah, actually, that's a little off. So let's go ahead and use this line instead of this one I just drew, just to make our life easy so that we don't have to change it anywhere else. And if we were going to sew this pattern entirely up, now everything would match. All the lines would look really nice and match together. Okay, so our new notch, our new slash point for our princess line. That looks better anyway, right in the center. Okay, so once we have this, we're gonna go ahead and cut this entirely. So because we're gonna cut entirely down this line that we just made, what we actually have to do is transfer our grain line over to this side. Because once we cut this from this, we're not gonna have a grain line over here, and that's really gonna mess us up. So what we can do is just square off of our current grain line. So I'm coming over like 3 inches, and see how I'm lining this up here. And now I can make a little grain line on this side too, so that when I cut these up, I know that these are gonna be perfect. Another thing I want to do, because I'm going to cut these apart, is I'm going to want to put notches here to connect, so that I can connect these back together. Once I separate them, it's going to be difficult to know exactly where they go back together. So what I do is just using my ruler. This says about 2 inches up from the bust point. That's good. Since we're doing these half scale ones, we could do half of that. We could say 1 inch up from the bust point. See, I'm just giving myself a notch on either side. This will be a way that once I cut it apart, I can still connect it back together. And then same thing. So I'm gonna wanna do 1 inch down, a notch, and then I'm gonna do it on this side too. You could close the dart and do both at the same time, but I think this should also work. When I reattach these two pieces and I close these together, I'll be able to see exactly where they go. It seems a little crazy and excessive now, but I promise you by the time we cut this up, we'll be glad that we did all these things. So now I'm gonna cut it. And again, I'm gonna cut off my pencil line. And I'm cutting right past this because I know I don't need it. I'll show you in a sec. But basically the princess style, what it does is it eliminates darts. You still have the exact same shape of a fitted bodice, but you don't have any darts. Instead, you've got the shape built in. So what we do is we just close all of our darts and sew it together on this new pretty line that we've created. I'm just throwing my excess paper out of the way, cutting very carefully again because I'll have to trace this one more time. This is just my worksheet. But we will, no longer have any of these pesky darts. Okay, so now I've got it all cut, and now I'll just cut on this line here. And I'm going to follow that line exactly. Even if it seems like it has a funny angle right now, when we trace this again later is when we will correct that. So here I have one piece, and notice that I've got notches so that I can still match this back up. And I don't need this. Remember, this was our dart excess. So I can go ahead and cut that out right now. And I've got this kind of shape. And again, see how if I was sewing it, I would match it up here, and I would turn, and match it up there. Perfect. Okay, so let's now take this like one step at a time. So first we'll work on this little side here, which is, again, this is Just to remind you, this is our side seam over here. This is not our center front anymore. It's our princess line. It's the middle, okay? But that is still our side seam. So what we can do is bring this where we have it at the bust point. We can come over, it says in the text on a full size, about 3/4 of an inch. So we can do it maybe about half that, maybe about 1/4 of an inch or a little more, basically kind of like dropping our bust. And we can draw new lines for that. And the real reason we want to do this, there we go, so you can kind of see, I've just dropped this a little bit and drew new lines, is because we're going to open this up, and if we do, it's going to give us a funny little shape right at the bust. So this is how we can drop that right away. So I've taken that away, and then what they say to do is to come straight across from that bust point here and to snip there as well. And you can, oops, I snipped it all the way. I was going to say try not to snip all the way, but you can. So what we'll do now is, even if we did snip all the way, we're going to close this together just perfectly. And what happens, it's hard to see, but you get like a little tiny fish mouth right here. You get like a tiny little opening, which is why we sliced that. If we tried to close this all the way and we weren't slicing right there, it would try to buckle on us. So we're just going to cut the ease in that it needs, basically. So again, I'm going to just make sure these line up beautifully on the side seam side and close these darts up. And we've got that little opening, tiny fish mouth there. And we've got all our notches, and then we can now retrace this. So I'll show you what I mean. So we can put this down on our paper. If you're a stickler for things going in the right direction, we can follow our grain line right now and make our grain line kind of match up with the paper. Or, you know, you can change this around, but definitely pay attention to that fact. Our grain line goes this way. If you were to lay this pattern piece down, you might think that it should go like this, but definitely because we transferred that, we want to know that our grain line goes in this direction. So what I can do is try to trace this, and I'm going to make sure I put in all those notches that we added afterwards. And our original armhole notch. And we don't need anything here on the side seam. And there we go. I'll draw my little tiny fish mouth. And then before I lift this up, I want to transfer this grain line. So here's where I might use my tracing wheel. And now that's transferred through. You can see the little dots where my grain line is. Okay. So I'll put that in, maybe right away. Here's my grain line. And then with this funny little shape that we've got going on right here, this is where our pretty French curve is going to come into play. And what we want to do is just kind of turn this until we get a nice connection, right? Because what we want is this to be this pretty like rounded shape, because it's going to go right around the bust. You don't want like a weird pointed fisheye, right? So I usually kind of use this side, and notice how I'm just pushing up until one side hits up here and one side hits down here, and then I can just, whoops, retrace. And if you see, now I get this pretty shape that blends the two seamlessly, and I can erase the rest. Look how nice and pretty and round that is. So this is why that French curve is really important. And then this piece is pretty much done. The book goes on to say that you can pull it out 1/16 of an inch up here on the top of the bust and pull it back in 1/8 of an inch here at the bottom to create like a really nice shape and fit. I usually don't do that. Honestly, those are such small amounts. I usually just leave it. And what I'll do is if I was to make this up and try it on a fit model, I may make adjustments at that time. But honestly, and especially because we're on a half scale and this is so tiny, let's not worry about that 1/16 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch here and there. Let's just do it as is. I think as long as we get this nice round shape here, I'm pretty satisfied with that. So now I'm just going to draw this a little bit darker because I feel like when I traced, my lines are really light. There we go, and up here. And then I can add seam allowance. And I'm almost ready with a complete pattern. So again, I'm going to add 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to really be careful around that pretty curve that I made, that I follow my new line. I can even erase my old little fish mouth bits to make sure they're not in my way. And I'm just toggling my drafting ruler around so that I get a nice shape there. And something to note, and I know we haven't, put all the seam allowance in yet, but these notches, I don't want to lose them, right? These are my good notches. They're going to help me line up my pieces when I need to put them back together. So I'll go ahead and cross those now while I'm thinking about it. Okay, so those are looking great. Go all the way around with my 1/4 inch. And again, that side seam should always be nice and straight. Shoulder seam should also be nice and straight. And now I've just got this tricky little armhole with its curves to add my seam allowance to. But again, I'm just toggling around bit by bit with my drafting ruler. To get this just right. There we go. And now this notch in the armhole, I'll make sure it goes all the way across. I'll make sure it has a nice straight cross. And then I can make sure to square off all my corners so that my lines go all the way and it's really clear where I'm sewing and where I'm cutting. And I think that's all my pretty corners. So now I've got a finished pattern. Oh, this line kind of didn't connect all the way. I'll erase anything on the outside that I didn't mean to go there. And so this is now my classic princess side front. Because remember, and I'll put a little side seam SS over here, this is the side seam. So this is my side of my front, and the pattern piece is called Classic Princess. We're no longer cutting it anywhere on fold, right? There's no folds anymore. This has got to be 2 pieces. So on my grain line, I can now say, just cut 2. and you would cut two mirrored pieces. So this pattern piece is pretty much done. So now I've got to go back to this piece that we had and trace it. And so same, I could line my grain line here up with the grain line of the paper. Oops. See if I can trace this. It's so hard to trace the paper without it moving on me. And definitely, again, use a weight if you need to or something so that this doesn't move. And then I definitely want to transfer in those notches that I added. And in this case, I could still use my tracing wheel to get my grain line, but actually remember this grain line I pulled off of this center front line. So I can just do the same thing again. So I know that's my center front. Again, I'm just going to redraw that because I traced it really lightly. And then I will put my grain line about a 1/2 inch in. And this you probably still do want cut on fold, right? This, you don't have to, obviously you can always have a seam going down the front, but typically down the front we have it cut on fold. So we'll go back to the same way that we do that. Cut one on fold here, because this is our, I'll label it center front, right, still. And with this piece, we don't really have to true anything up. Truing it up is when we kind of adjust the shape slightly if it gets a little wonky, because this is already actually pretty smooth. I think it's a good looking shape. It doesn't, you know, jet out in any weird way. So I feel pretty good about it. If you had made big adjustments, you know, by taking in a little 16th or 1/8 of an inch on this shape, you could kind of transfer it over here. But since we really didn't, I think it actually works out. These two should match up pretty nicely. So we can just go ahead and add the seam allowance. So we don't need seam allowance on the front because that's cut on fold. So we do need it here at the bottom. And notice that this bottom, it has the slightest curve to it. Oops. Can't really see that. There we go. It's ever so slight, but you'll notice when you're putting your ruler up to it. And same, this is not really straight. There's a kind of curve, so don't lose that shape when you're adding your seam allowance. You'll notice what I mean. It's just really slight, but just toggle your drafting ruler so that you're adding the correct shape and the correct seam allowance. And we'll add it to the shoulder and to the neckline. And again, I'm just toggling slowly round, making little marks and then connecting the dots. Get that pretty neckline shape. Okay, and now I just want to make sure all my corners look good and that all the lines continue where they should. And squaring off those corners. Sometimes when you trace, you kind of lose a bit, so it's just cleaning it back up, making sure it's all clean and neat. It's super easy for anyone to understand and follow. Make sure these two notches are really obvious of where they need to be, and then create the cross. There we go. So I think this pattern is all set now, and this becomes the classic princess front, because you could also say classic princess center front, but this is the classic princess front, and the other one is the side front. I think we've got everything that we need on here. And then what would happen is, again, we could cut these out and see that if we were going to sew these together, these two would match up, and you would turn that at that angle and sew on it, and you would get the shape built in without any darts. And so we can go ahead and draw what this would look like on each. So we've got same shape we always do of a very fitted little bodice, but we've got now this pretty line that comes from the middle of the shoulder straight down, breaking up now the bodice into 3 pretty panels, you know, which is always really slimming. It gives this idea that the waist is sort of just here, and you could even do this, say, in a contrast fabric or something like that. And it's a very slimming, flattering line. And again, if you think about the fact that, you know, this is actually the center front of your garment, you've broken it up into 4 segments. But if you cut it on fold, it ends up looking like 3, and it looks really pretty. And so we can draw that on both, just so we have it. Again, it comes from the shoulder and follows down that princess line. And these are the front pieces. And next, I'll do a little video showing you how to do the back pieces, which we'll also have 2.